In the stillness of a European village, where the cobblestone streets slept beneath the hush of dawn, a child was born into what seemed an ordinary life. The air carried no omen, no whisper of the strangeness to come. Yet before the boy could even steady his steps, his mouth formed words that should not have belonged to him, fragmented utterances of fire, steel, and death. Mothers laughed it off, fathers shook their heads, but the fragments sharpened. Names of generals long forgotten, battles that existed only in the faded ink of neglected chronicles. Elders stirred uneasily, recognizing sounds they had not heard since their own grandparents' tales. Could a newborn inherit the weight of war? Could a life begin already bound to memories that did not belong? Beneath the calm facade of the village, a darker truth whispered. The past had found a voice in the frail body of a child. The village lay nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, its cobbled streets still carrying the scars of past wars. Old stone walls bore faint scorch marks, and certain houses leaned with the weight of battles long concluded. Yet against this backdrop of lingering memory, peace had finally returned. Fields once trampled by soldiers now rippled with wheat, and orchards heavy with fruit promised abundance. Families rebuilt their lives with calloused hands, trading sorrow for the rhythm of plows and harvest songs. Children's laughter wove through narrow lanes, mingling with the clatter of hooves and the murmur of merchants at the market square. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted from cottage hearths, and every Sunday the toll of church bells gathered souls together, their sound rising like a promise of order and divine favor. In this fragile harmony, the people of the village found comfort, though beneath their smiles faint shadows of memory persisted. It was here, in this seemingly ordinary existence, that the child was born. His arrival was heralded not by omens or strange portents, but by the simple joy of parents cradling their first son. Neighbors flocked to their door with baskets of grain, cheese, and wine, blessings spoken with warmth. The young mother glowed with relief. The father clasped hands firmly with kin and friends, and all believed the boy would inherit a life untouched by the cruelties that had scarred their elders. For a while it seemed true. He grew within a world that valued small certainties. The roosters crow at dawn, the hush of prayer before meals, the quiet pride of work well done. At dusk, lanterns flickered in windows, casting golden light across weary faces, and songs drifted from taverns where old men spoke of survival, not despair. Each day reinforced the illusion that their struggles had finally yielded a lasting peace. The boy's future appeared stable, wrapped in the innocence of a place that had learned to heal. Yet the calm was fragile, a still pond hiding the restless currents beneath. For though the village rejoiced in its return to normality, the air sometimes carried whispers too faint to follow. A lone crow circling the steeple, a sudden hush in the marketplace, a dog growling at shadows no one else could see. These were brushed aside as superstition. The people chose not to look too closely, for they had suffered enough. And so they leaned into hope, blind to the truth that the life beginning within their walls would soon unravel the delicate order they clung to. What seemed ordinary was merely the silence before the fracture. It began quietly, with sounds that most parents would have cherished. At barely more than a year old, the boy's lips shaped words with startling clarity. Where other children babbled nonsense, his voice carried syllables sharp and deliberate. At first his mother smiled, believing her son blessed with uncommon intelligence. But as the weeks passed, the words grew darker, their meanings heavier. Instead of calling for food or naming his parents, he whispered of smoke, of gunfire, of names no villager had ever spoken aloud in his presence. By the time he reached 2 years, his vocabulary had become unsettlingly precise. At night, when the fire dimmed, he muttered to himself words that chilled the marrow of those who overheard. His father, returning late from the tavern, froze when he heard the child whispering of marching men, of iron and ash, in a tone far too steady for his tender age. The parents convinced themselves it was imagination, the mind of a child catching stray fragments from adult conversations. Yet in truth, no one had spoken such words in their household for years. The first true shiver of dread came one afternoon when the local priest visited. The child, sitting upon his mother's lap, suddenly recited a passage, an old battle prayer once spoken centuries earlier, before swords were replaced by rifles. The priest's face drained of color. He knew the prayer well. It was not found in the scriptures read on Sundays, but in dusty chronicles of a war fought long before the boy's birth. How could he know it? Who had taught him? The room grew unbearably silent, the only sound the child's steady voice finishing the final line, with a solemnity that did not belong to him. Word spread swiftly. In the market square, whispers carried from stall to stall, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed the boy was possessed, that he bore the tongue of a wandering spirit. Others said he carried memories not his own, as though the soil of the battlefield had seeped into his blood before he ever drew breath. Mothers pulled their children away when he passed, while men shook their heads but avoided meeting his gaze. Fear took root, quiet but persistent, the kind that makes neighbors glance over their shoulders long after the sun has set. At home, his parents struggled against the truth pressing upon them. They hushed him when he spoke, prayed loudly to drown his mutterings, and clung desperately to the illusion that he was still just a child. But the boy's eyes, dark, watchful, far older than his years, betrayed something they could not deny. He seemed less like a son born to them, and more like a vessel for echoes no one had summoned. What should have been innocent words became wounds reopening in a village that wanted only to forget. The ordinary peace was ruptured, and though no one dared admit it aloud, the boy had become a living reminder that the past was not finished. It still breathed through him. By the time the boy turned 3, silence was no longer his most unsettling trait. He had begun to draw clumsy, uneven sketches on scraps of parchment his father brought home from the mill. At first they seemed harmless, stick figures and shapes any child might scrawl. But when his mother looked closer, her breath caught. Horses with bridles of iron, cannons with wide, gaping mouths, rows of men in uniforms marked by insignias that no villager could recognize. The detail was crude yet unmistakable, as though the child's tiny hands carried knowledge far beyond his years. When neighbors visited, they studied the drawings with nervous laughter. One old farmer grew pale, muttering that the symbols reminded him of tales passed down by his grandfather, stories of regiments that once marched through the valley, leaving ash and broken bodies in their wake. "Those banners," he whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. "I have heard of them before, though not in my lifetime." His words rippled through the room, planting unease that no prayer could erase. The elders began to murmur among themselves. Memories of wars long buried resurfaced in hushed conversations at the tavern and after Sunday Mass. They recalled stories of fire in the fields, of entire families displaced, of church bells tolling not for worship, but for the dead. It was said that the soil itself still carried the scent of blood, though new grass had long since covered it. Now looking at the boy's sketches, it seemed as if those forgotten horrors had clawed their way back into the present. His parents grew protective, yet fear gnawed at them like a relentless pest. His mother gathered the drawings in secret, tucking them into a chest as though hiding them might somehow smother the truth. His father, unable to bear the weight of it, burned several in the hearth one night. But the boy only drew more, each picture clearer than the last, as though guided by some unseen hand. When asked what the images meant, he answered in that steady, too-knowing voice, "They were there before." Whispers spread quickly. Some in the village declared the child cursed, a vessel for demonic whispers. Others believed he was chosen, a sign from God meant to remind them of sins yet unatoned. A few argued he was simply ill, his mind afflicted by something that had no name. But beneath every explanation lay the same trembling fear. None could deny that what he drew, what he spoke, had roots tangled deep in history. Ordinary life began to warp under his shadow. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed. Fathers crossed themselves in silent prayer. Market stalls, once lively, grew tense when his family appeared, conversations cutting off mid-sentence. Even the sound of church bells, once a comfort, seemed hollow now, echoing against the knowledge that innocence had been tainted. At night, when wind rattled the shutters, villagers imagined the boy's drawings coming to life, the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, the smoke curling once more above their rooftops. It was as if their fragile peace had been pierced, not by invaders from beyond, but by a child born within their own walls. The boy had become more than flesh and blood. He was a mirror to the past, and the reflection it showed was too dark to face without trembling. The first to look beyond fear was the village schoolteacher, a man named Herr Kraus, whose curiosity often bordered on obsession. He had watched the boy from a distance, noting how his words carried the rhythm of history rather than the imagination of a child. At 3 years old, most spoke of games, food, or family. This boy spoke of formations, maneuvers, and death. Kraus began to record what he heard, scribbling the child's utterances in a notebook, with the precision of one who sensed their importance. When he shared his notes with elders, they dismissed him as indulgent, warning him not to give weight to the boy's ravings. But Kraus persisted, cross-referencing his records against the few battered volumes that remained in the village library. What he discovered chilled him. The words matched descriptions of battles long erased from local memory. Not the well-known clashes that filled official chronicles, but forgotten skirmishes, villages burned, officers slain, troop movements buried in obscurity. The boy's phrases aligned too perfectly, as though his lips carried testimony from the grave. News of Kraus's findings spread cautiously at first, whispered after Sunday Mass, and shared in muted tones at the marketplace. Yet the whispers grew louder when he invited 2 visiting historians from the nearby city to examine his notes. They listened skeptically, but as the boy repeated names and places, their composure faltered. One historian dropped his quill, muttering that the child had recalled a general whose deeds had been struck from most accounts. Remembered only in a single obscure manuscript, the confirmation struck the villagers like a thunderclap. Fear thickened, but so too did fascination. People began to visit the boy's home, pretending politeness while straining to hear his words. Mothers clutched their children closer, yet could not resist returning to listen again. Farmers who once shunned him now lingered outside his door, caught between awe and dread. Each new utterance was treated like prophecy, though none knew whether it foretold salvation or doom. Inevitably, the outside world took notice. A local newspaper printed a short column under the headline, "Boy Soldier Reborn." Strange claims from a quiet village. The piece, half dismissive and half sensational, described the child as a curiosity, a relic of war walking once more among the living. Some readers laughed, others recoiled, but many clipped the story to share with neighbors. Soon letters began to arrive from journalists, clergymen, and even spiritualists, each eager to witness what they could not comprehend. The boy's family felt the walls closing in. What had begun as whispers in their own village was spreading beyond their control. Strangers appeared at their gate, knocking with gifts of bread or wine, hoping to be admitted. Some sought miracles, believing the child divinely touched. Others sought spectacle, demanding he perform like an actor on a stage. Still others came trembling, convinced that he was an omen of more violence to come. Through it all, the boy seemed strangely detached, as if the attention belonged to someone else. He would sit calmly, eyes distant, and speak of smoke curling over ridges, of rivers running red, of the silence that followed volleys of gunfire. His words were not frantic but deliberate, as though reporting from memory. For the villagers, awe and terror had become indistinguishable. Each testimony deepened their unease, binding them to a mystery that refused to release them. What had once been the shadow of war was now a spectacle, carried on ink-stained pages and whispered across parishes. And yet, beneath the frenzy, one question pulsed without answer. Was this boy merely echoing the dead, or was he, in some unfathomable way, one of them? The nights grew longer for the boy's family, not because of the seasons, but because of the cries that now split the silence. At first it was murmurs in his sleep, fragments of orders, half-formed words spat out as if his dreams belonged to another man. But as the weeks passed, the whispers sharpened into screams. He would bolt upright in bed, fists clenched, eyes glassy, and shout commands in a voice far too harsh for a child his age. "Advance! Hold the line! Fire!" His parents rushed to comfort him, but he shoved them away as though they were soldiers failing in their duty. Neighbors began to hear the disturbances. The sound of a boy's voice cutting through the midnight air was unnatural, carrying the cadence of battle into homes where people had long tried to forget it. Some villagers claimed they heard more than just words, that they could make out the pounding of phantom hooves, the crack of muskets, the roar of cannon fire reverberating with him. Doors stayed bolted at night, and shutters were drawn tighter, as if wood and iron might keep the echoes from creeping inside. One night, his father described the horror of watching the child's body stiffen as if struck by invisible blows. He rolled on the floor, gasping, muttering about choking smoke and blinding flashes. When asked what he had seen, the boy recounted in excruciating detail an ambush where hundreds had been slaughtered at dawn. He described the uniforms down to their frayed cuffs, the color of banners soaked in blood, and even the dying words of a commander cut down mid-sentence. The schoolteacher, Herr Kraus, brought historians back to the house to hear for themselves. They listened, pale and trembling, as the boy told of a massacre fought in a narrow valley. His account matched a half-forgotten event buried in archives, an engagement so brutal that few survived to tell it. The chilling part was not that he knew it happened, but that he described things no record had ever revealed. The sound of horses panicking as cannonballs tore through their ranks, the particular hymn sung by soldiers before being massacred, and the prayer muttered by the wounded as they were abandoned. Historians admitted later that only by reading long-sealed military journals could one know such details, and yet here was a child, barely 4 years old, recounting them with the calmness of memory. The villagers no longer whispered. They avoided the family altogether, muttering curses when they passed their home. Some claimed the child was possessed not by one ghost, but by a chorus of the dead, the spirits of an entire battlefield clawing their way back through his fragile body. Others insisted it was punishment, a divine rebuke reminding them of sins they preferred not to name. His mother began to fray under the strain. She begged priests to bless the home, sprinkling holy water in every corner. Candles burned through the night, but their flames only seemed to flicker faster when the child woke screaming. His father, once stoic, began drinking heavily, trying to drown the sounds of war that returned every night through his son's throat. Their home, once filled with hope, became a place of dread, where each evening carried the same question: what horror would the boy relive next? Perhaps the most unsettling moment came one evening when the boy woke, stared directly at his parents and said, "I have died before." His tone was flat, unshaken, as though stating a fact as ordinary as his own name. That night, no one in the household slept. His words had crossed a line. He was no longer a child who spoke strangely. He was a vessel carrying something older, darker and utterly unexplainable. The cries continued, each one a wound reopened, each one forcing the village to hear the war they had tried so hard to bury. In those nights it became clear. The battlefield had not vanished into history. It still lived, in a boy whose small frame carried the unbearable weight of countless forgotten deaths. At first, the boy's parents clung to hope. They told themselves that his strange mutterings were just dreams, that his night terrors would fade with age. But as the night stretched into months, as his voice deepened into the ragged tones of dead soldiers, their optimism curdled into dread. The once warm house grew colder, not from the chill of winter, but from the silence that followed every scream. The mother, pale with sleeplessness, whispered to neighbors that her son had been touched by a curse. She avoided his gaze, terrified that behind those young eyes something ancient was staring back. The father, however, saw divinity in his child. To him the boy was chosen, a vessel carrying truths long buried. His voice trembled with awe each time the child recited forgotten regiments, their names etched in blood and memory. What began as private disagreements swelled into furious arguments. By candlelight the parents clashed, her voice sharp with fear, his steady with stubborn faith. Pots went untouched on the hearth, letters unanswered, neighbors' knocks ignored. The boy, caught in the crossfire, withdrew deeper into himself. He no longer sought comfort in his mother's arms, nor played by his father's side. Instead he sat in corners, whispering in fragments, battle cries, death chants, last breaths. His words were not his own, yet no one dared to stop him. Outside their crumbling home, whispers spread like wildfire. The neighbors, once sympathetic, began to mutter that the boy should be taken away. Some said a monastery might cleanse him. Others whispered of darker remedies, of sending him into the woods where spirits wandered. Fear had seeped into the soil of the village, and the family bore its full weight. At night the parents lay side by side but worlds apart. The mother turned her face to the wall, praying for deliverance, while the father stared into the shadows, convinced angels lingered near. The boy's cries would rise again, echoing like a ghostly chorus, and with each outburst, another piece of their marriage splintered. The bond that had once seemed unshakable now cracked beneath the haunting presence of a child who was no longer entirely theirs. The villagers noticed the change. Where once the family was seen walking to church together, now the mother came alone. Her steps hurried, her eyes downcast. The father lingered at taverns, speaking in hushed tones of prophecy, declaring his son a sign of divine will. The boy himself rarely appeared in daylight, pale and hollow-eyed, his lips twitching with whispers only he could hear. Inside the home, silence became the loudest presence. The laughter of earlier years was gone, replaced by dread that seeped into every stone of the walls. Even simple tasks, breaking bread, mending clothes, became heavy rituals, as though the air itself resisted normality. The child, sensitive to every fracture, became the mirror of their collapse. He spoke less of himself and more of others, voices of men who had perished decades ago, voices of enemies and allies alike. The collapse of the household mirrored the unrest beyond its walls. Just as the village struggled to reconcile fear with fascination, the family wrestled with belief and despair. In every shattered conversation, in every silent meal, the weight of the supernatural pressed down, threatening to break them entirely. By the time spring returned, the home was no longer a place of refuge. It was a battlefield of its own, one where faith fought against fear, love against suspicion, and the living against the voices of the dead. The boy's voice, once dismissed as childish rambling, finally draws the attention of a local historian, a man devoted to unearthing the forgotten corners of the region's violent past. Unlike priests or fearful neighbors, he listens with precision, taking notes as the boy describes landscapes he should never know. A bend in the river where the reeds grow tall, a ridge where iron once clashed on iron, a grove where the fallen still whisper. Driven by both skepticism and an uneasy fascination, the historian follows these details into the depths of the forest. The path is wild, overgrown, untouched by farmers for generations. Yet each step aligns uncannily with the child's account. At a clearing, his lantern beam catches the dull glint of metal. There, half buried in moss and soil, lies the shattered curve of a helmet, its iron mottled with centuries of rust. A few feet further, the jagged remains of a sword jut from the earth like broken teeth. The more he searches, the more he finds. Fragments of buckles, splintered musket barrels, even buttons still etched with the faint insignia of long-dead regiments. But it is the ground itself that holds the most disturbing truth. Digging shallowly, the historian uncovers bones, rows of them, some scattered, some still aligned as though soldiers had fallen side by side. No markers, no memorials, only silence and decay. It is not a battlefield recorded in town ledgers or school books. It is a graveyard erased from collective memory. Yet the boy had spoken of it as if he had stood among the dying only yesterday. Word spreads quickly. At first whispered in taverns and kitchens the child knew, then printed boldly in newspapers, accompanied by lurid sketches of helmets and swords pulled from the dirt. The line between folklore and fact blurs overnight. For villagers who once dismissed the boy as cursed, the revelation forces a terrifying reconsideration. How could he, with no access to books, maps, or even proper schooling, recall the precise geography of a battle that history itself had forgotten? Some argue divine inspiration. Others whisper darker possibilities. Reincarnation, possession, or an ancestral memory buried so deep that it surfaced in this one fragile vessel. The boy, meanwhile, grows more spectral in presence. He does not gloat nor explain. He only continues to murmur in the voices of the fallen, his small frame trembling, as if his body is merely a conduit. The historian, though lauded for his discovery, is privately shaken. He pores over military records, searching for matches to the boy's accounts. Again and again he finds subtle confirmations, names of commanders, strategies of flanking maneuvers, even the positions of regiments that never made it into public record. The more he verifies, the more he questions the very nature of memory. Is history not just written in books and monuments, but etched into the air, the soil, the marrow of the living? The town, once divided between superstition and faith, now stands united in dread. Markets fall silent when the boy passes. Church sermons turn desperate, warning of unseen forces that cling to the living. Parents clutch their children tighter at night, fearing the weight of battles long over might yet settle upon them. In the end, the revelation does not soothe, it unsettles. It suggests that time does not bury the past. It only layers it, thin as gauze through which certain souls can still see. The boy is no longer merely a child of flesh and bone, but a reminder that the dead are never entirely gone. In his trembling voice lies a truth no one dares fully confront. Memory itself may be eternal, and some memories refuse to rest. As the story of the boy spreads beyond the town's borders, strangers begin arriving, curious onlookers, reporters eager for sensation, and scholars seeking proof. But with each new set of eyes fixed upon him, the child weakens. His once restless energy dims into frailty, his skin flushed with fevers that come in violent waves. Nights are worst. He wakes shivering, drenched in sweat, whispering that he can hear the drums and the screams again. He insists he is being called back, as though the battlefield itself demands his return. The family, already fractured, can no longer contain their terror. The mother prays desperately, placing charms above his bed. The father, pale with sleeplessness, paces the floorboards, muttering of fate and sacrifice. Neighbors whisper that the boy's suffering is punishment for secrets unearthed, that the dead resent being stirred from their silence. The house becomes a shrine of dread, each hour heavy with the sense of something approaching. Then, on a storm-racked night, the climax arrives. Rain lashes the windows, thunder shakes the beams, and the boy tosses in fevered delirium. He rises once, startling his parents, and declares in a voice not his own, "I'm going back." His words echo unnaturally, as though carried on a wind from another century. Exhausted, he collapses again, and his parents, helpless, keep vigil until their own exhaustion overtakes them. By morning, he is gone. His bed, once damp with fever, is empty and cold. The window shows no sign of force, the door no trace of passage. Only one thing remains upon the pillow, a crude drawing in charcoal, the shaky hand of a child. It depicts a grave beneath a crooked tree, marked not with a cross but with his own name etched upon the stone. Panic grips the household. Search parties comb the woods, lanterns swinging wildly through rain-darkened paths. They find no footprints, no torn fabric, no hint of where the boy has gone. The historian, shaken to his core, mutters that perhaps the child has simply followed the voices to their resting place. Priests declare it the hand of God. Skeptics whisper of abduction. Yet none can explain the impossible neatness of his disappearance, as though he dissolved into air. In the days that follow, silence blankets the town. The constant dread that once filled the streets is replaced by something stranger, a fragile relief, mingled with horror. Some say the boy was a curse lifted at last. Others argue he was a messenger, taken back to where he belonged. But whenever the wind sweeps over the fields, carrying faint echoes of distant drums, townsfolk shiver, remembering the child who carried the battlefield inside his small frame. The drawing remains, the only relic of his final night. Many avoid looking at it, unable to bear the suggestion that the boy himself foretold his grave. And so the vanishing is left unresolved, suspended between myth and fact, between terror and deliverance. The child is gone, but his absence weighs heavier than his presence ever did. The house where it all began now stands hollow, its silence deeper than any storm. Once filled with the restless cries of a boy burdened by memories too old for his small body, it has become a monument of absence. Dust lies heavy upon the cradle, and the faint scent of smoke and damp wood lingers, as if the place itself has been scorched by something unseen. No toys remain, no laughter, no warmth, only the single drawing left behind, its lines rough, its meaning terrible. Villagers avoid passing by the house at dusk. They whisper that the child's shadow still lingers, caught between the living and the dead. To them, the drawing is no mere artifact of a fevered mind. It is prophecy, a mark of truth. For though historians searched tirelessly, they never uncovered the grave the boy had depicted. Yet locals insist that somewhere beneath a crooked tree lies the resting place of a soldier whose story was never recorded, except through the trembling hand of a child. The historian who once followed the boy's words into the forest now speaks less boldly. He admits that history often preserves battles in ink and stone, but the true weight of war is carried in silence, in scars passed down unseen. Perhaps the boy was not cursed nor possessed, but instead became a vessel for those unburied memories, proof that trauma does not die when the guns fall silent. It lingers like smoke long after a fire, drifting into new generations. As the years pass, the story becomes legend. Outsiders dismiss it as superstition, while locals retell it in hushed tones, shaping it into warning. They say that war never truly ends, it echoes, sometimes in nightmares, sometimes in broken families, And sometimes, most hauntingly, in the fragile body of a child who should never have known its horrors. The final image is the drawing itself, fragile paper preserved in glass. Viewers study it, unsettled by its simplicity. A grave, a crooked tree, a name that should not have been written. It is both an ending and a question. Was the boy evidence that memory transcends death, that violence carves itself into the very fabric of time? Or was he only a reminder, cruel and fleeting, that some wars refuse to be forgotten because they were never truly over?